Hello, and welcome to this Bournbrook interview. I'm Bournbrook's media editor, SD Wickett, and I spoke to chairman of the Bow Group, Ben Harris-Quinney, about the crisis in conservatism. I opened up by asking Ben about what the decline of the Labour Party means for the Tories.
Well, I think the problem is the disingenuity in front of the public, in that when David Cameron put himself forward as a candidate, he ran as a Conservative. He was talking about broken society and the failures of multiculturalism. When he became Prime Minister, all of that went out the window, and there was really nothing to discern between him and Blair. When he went, Theresa May came in and billed herself as the next Thatcher. And of course, that very quickly became abundantly clear that it was not the case. Boris did the same thing. He wrapped himself in the colours of Brexit, which were, riven with nationhood, with civic nationalism, with patriotism, with a desire to see an end to mass immigration, an end to globalism. And he wrapped himself in all of those things, but he was never of those things. In fact, he was never even of Brexit. He was an opportunist that jumped on the bandwagon. In 2019, we warned about this. The Bow Group did not support Boris Johnson because we know Boris Johnson's credentials as a liberal globalist. And a lot of people that I have great respect for didn't want to hear that. They wanted to believe, just like they want to believe with GB News, that Boris was going to mark an end to the Blair years. And of course, what we've actually seen with what Boris is proposing is higher immigration than we had under the European Union, stronger loony green policies than we had under the European Union, more globalization than we had under the European Union. And those are all the opposite things of what Brexiteers voted for. And what I'm seeing in the Bow Group and without, people are starting to wake up to the fact that Boris is just another cog. And I think when they do that, that 80-seat majority support will melt away. I think because of the size of the majority, it would be very difficult for Labour to win. And of course, I don't want Labour to win the next election. I want a proper Conservative Party to win the next election. But I think there is a likelihood that you will see a fracturing on the right. There are a number of new parties: Reform, Reclaim, Heritage, and I think you'll see that and more, where people are now, after over 10 years of Conservative government, they've woken up to the con that has become the Conservative Party. And even if it means not being in power, they want to build new movements that are genuinely conservative. And so I think you're going to see a fracturing on the right, but then hopefully the forming of a constellation or a coalition that can come together and actually deliver genuine conservative and patriotic principles for the nation, which is what the majority of the nation have always wanted. They've simply had no option to vote for it, and they're so desperate for the option to vote for it when even a phony comes along that perhaps deep down they know doesn't represent it, but wraps himself in the colours of it. They go for it. That's what happened with Boris Johnson. But I think the people have now woken up to that fact, and they want a change.
What I'm hearing and seeing is a party that is ostensibly conservative, but is utterly infested with liberalism. Where does that come from? Is that simply a matter of Thatcher and neoliberalism, or is it a result of the collapse of the Liberal Party in the interwar years, and the Tories just sort of hoovering up that vote and adapting its base?
Well, I remember an account of a conversation with Michael Heseltine, my old friend Michael Heseltine, which essentially at the Carlton Club, where he was saying, look, I'm a liberal, but liberals don't get elected, so I joined the Conservative Party. And I think that is part of the decline of the Liberal Party, although we should remember that the Liberal Party was not liberal in the modern sense. It was liberal in a much more classical sense. And a modern liberal, a progressive, is really further to the left than the socialists of the last few decades. a modern liberal, a progressive, would be further to the left than Tony Benn, for example. Thatcher is accorded with a huge amount of blame for it, and I think, I spoke with Margaret Thatcher about these issues on a number of occasions, and I think what has happened with Margaret Thatcher is due to the sort of what those in Westminster describe as the Tufton Street Mafia, the Centre for Policy Studies, the Institute for Economic Affairs, the Adam Smith Institute. They have all bastardized Thatcherism into something that it wasn't. Margaret Thatcher was a nationalist. This idea that Margaret Thatcher was this sort of do what thou wilt, everyone can have a free-for-all and do whatever they want is nonsense. She was a very strong social conservative. And I would encourage people to read what Margaret Thatcher said and listen to what Margaret Thatcher said, rather than the new advocates of neoliberalism talking about what Margaret Thatcher believed. I mean, it's quite extraordinary what a lot of people are now pushing in the name of Thatcherism, transgenderism, the more extreme elements of the LGBT lobby, mass immigration. None of these things were things that Margaret Thatcher supported, and actually they were things that Margaret Thatcher very, very strongly opposed. So, and that goes back to the last question, really. What is happening before the public is a huge confidence trick on the part of the political establishment, and what people are saying they are and how people are presenting themselves is not the case. The Conservative Party isn't conservative. People that are calling themselves Thatcherites are not Thatcherites. So I think you've actually, unfortunately, as a citizen, you've got to do a hell of a lot of background reading and a deep dive yourself. You can't trust the media, you can't trust politicians, and you've got to really work out for yourself what is going on. And I think the use of language, the changing of the meanings of words, the changing of the historical legacy of people, it is a very Marxist approach, and that's what we're seeing, and that's how we have seen conservatism turn into modern liberalism, and it's how we've seen Thatcherism turned into the progressive agenda. It's all nonsense, it's all lies, but it requires a lot of groundwork, I think, to demonstrate that, and that's both on behalf of organisations like the Bow Group, but also the citizens who need to do, I think, a lot more work than citizens in the past to find out what's really going on.
Is there hope for the party itself? Is there room for a momentum start takeover of the party, or is it just a matter of other elements need to be boosted, or like you said, where should things fragment, or is there room for the party itself to reform to more conservative lines consistently rather than once every 5 years?
Well, the for a political party that governs Britain and puts itself forward as a paragon of democracy, the Conservative Party is one of the least democratic political parties on earth.
Yeah.
If you want to be a Conservative candidate, for example, you have to jump through their hoops. And the decision as to whether you get to become a candidate to become a member of Parliament ultimately is not one that rests by and large in the hands of the local constituents. It's one that rests by and large in the hands of Conservative Central Office, Conservative campaign headquarters. And the rank and file member, what is so frustrating about it is the rank and file membership of the Conservative Party is very staunchly conservative. I remember I was at a North East Hearts Conservative Association dinner in the run-up to the 2014 European elections, and I was told by the chairman of the association, well, of course, the vast majority of people here will be voting UKIP. Now, these are the people that aren't just notionally conservative, not even just members of the Conservative Party, but they're people who turn up to Conservative Association events, go out and deliver leaflets, and will then be voting for a different party. And that's because that rank and file membership, I think, actually is more in line with a party like UKIP or more in line with a party like Reform than the modern Conservative Party. The problem is that those views of the membership are never heard and not represented in the upper echelons of the party, because you can also look at the parliamentary party and there are a decreasing number but still a very, very large number of solidly Conservative MPs. The problem is that the people in charge in CCHQ and Downing Street are none of those things. And I think it's because of that, it's because of the tail wagging the dog, that you have a situation where the Conservative Party has become not just a poor ally of conservatism, but an enemy of conservatism. Where are the Conservative Party on BLM? Where are the Conservative Party on trans issues? They're not only not fighting against them, they're on the wrong side. And you can see that with so many issues. Going back to Brexit, yes, they've now wrapped themselves in the colours of Brexit because they had to. But this was a party that used government resources to campaign for Remain. And so if you can ultimately get them to change their view if it is that or death, but if left to their own devices, they will now pursue left-wing causes. And so unless that structure of the party changes, unless the gatekeepers change, because you've still got Conservative Central Office thinking, right, we need more not very independently minded, not very outspoken Cameroons, basically Blairites, to come through as our new generation of candidates. And so the problem for the Conservative Party is, in terms of how it recalibrates, how it returns to conservatism, is that all of the new people coming through are anti-conservatives. So who's going to stand up from the backbenches and lead the Conservative Party back to conservatism? It's very difficult to see how it happens. And I think, it reaches a point where it is better that the Conservative Party ceases to exist in the same way that it did in Canada. Because otherwise we have this situation where not only are the public being lied to in calling something conservatism that is the opposite of conservatism, but we have the guarantee of a slow death towards cultural Marxism, and many other forms of Marxism also. For example, David Cameron came to power on the basis of cutting the deficit and the national debt. The Conservative Party in the last 10 years have doubled the national debt. So they're not only not conservative on social issues, they're not conservative on fiscal issues either. Therefore, what's the point of them?
And it takes something. It takes an outside force to push them right. It was UKIP who forced the referendum out of them.
It absolutely was UKIP that forced the referendum out of them, and I was very involved in both the Brexit campaign and also the campaign against same-sex marriage, which directly led to UKIP's victory, in the sense that the Conservative Party lost more members over same-sex marriage than it had ever lost in its history for any other policy. The reports are vague, but they suggest about 40% of members resigned over same-sex marriage. And of course, under David Cameron, the membership of the Conservative Party reduced very significantly every year of his leadership. And so I think you can look at very clearly how David Cameron's push towards the hard left of politics, particularly on social issues, caused the rise of UKIP, and that counter-reaction pulled the Conservative Party back, because David Cameron famously said, when he started to push all these policies through, well, where else are they going to go? Where else are Conservative members and voters going to go? They have no choice but to vote for the Conservative Party. And what Nigel Farage proved was that actually they do have a choice, and that can very, very quickly change in modern politics. So UKIP was a massive feature of forcing that change, unquestionably. And Nigel Farage has done a huge amount in that cause. But as I said before, the problem is that the establishment, if left no other choice, and let's remember, after the Brexit vote, they spent 4 years trying to overturn it. But when it is made abundantly clear to them that Brexit is the only option, they will wrap themselves in the colours of Brexit, but then they will very slowly attempt to change what Brexit means. And you saw just the other day, James Forsyth, husband of Allegra Stratton, the number 10 press spokesman, arguing in the Times that Brexit was actually a vote for more immigration, not less. And it has been otherwise argued that Brexit is a vote for more Greta Thunberg style green nonsense, that it is a vote for more globalization, not less. And of course, all of those things are the absolute opposite of what Brexit was about and why people voted for Brexit. So left with no choice, yes, the establishment have wrapped itself in the colours of Brexit, but it is Brexit in name only. And on all other issues, they haven't learnt the lesson. And that's why I think that the Conservative Party is a hopeless cause, because even when faced with such a public evisceration that Brexit was, they still don't recognise that they don't just need to wrap themselves in the colours of Brexit and pretend to pursue Brexit while pursuing something else. They actually need to fundamentally change and return and connect with the people, which their first option to do is via their own membership. If they won't even listen to their own members, what hope do we have that they will listen to the people of the country? And I think what we're seeing from Boris Johnson, and particularly in recent months of the year, is almost a disdain for the public, a sort of whiff of corruption and cronyism that has crept in, that appears to almost be thumbing their nose at the public, that they know we know, but they don't care.
Brexit also shows what a ruthlessly self-preserving beast the party has become, where the very upper parts of the party, up to Downing Street, campaigned for Remain. The Prime Minister, after Cameron, campaigned for Remain. Yet it still managed to go into the next election, having been in power for 9 years as the For the People candidate, and it won. But I want to pivot slightly, and you mentioned CCHQ. You wrote in 2015 about your time in the CCHQ and how you advised against the disaster of allowing the party you to be that close to policy. What can you tell me about your time within the sort of the centre of the party and the culture within it?
Well, I never worked at Conservative campaign headquarters formally. I was very involved in a lot of the things that they were doing overseas, because I lived in Madrid for a number of years, and I set up Conservatives Abroad in Madrid, which became the sort of parent branch for Conservatives Abroad in Spain. And of course, we have 800,000 British citizens that live in Spain. So it was quite a significant part of the global initiative, to get expat citizens to vote Conservative. And of course, via my association with the Bow Group, I did lots with Conservative Central Office in those early years of both my chairmanship of the Bow Group and also the campaign to return the Conservative Party to government. My experience of these people at Conservative Central Office is that they are, again, not only not conservative, but anti-conservatives, but also they operate in an almost communist party way of silencing dissent, of, in inverted commas, killing off opposition and threatening and bullying people who don't toe the line. And where this came to prominence in my case was that in 2014, I was threatened by a guy called Mark Clark, who was working as a director at CCHQ at the time, who told me that I had to stop writing about the Westminster paedophile scandal and calling for democratisation of the Conservative Party, or they would smear me in the press as being a, quote, racist and homophobe.
Which they did.
They didn't at the time. I immediately wrote an article after that meeting with Mark Clark, explaining what had happened and warning them and others about the course of action they were taking, this sort of Nixonian dark arts approach to managing the party. And 9 months later, they actually smeared me as being, they forgot about the racism stuff. They smeared me as being a homophobe without any basis or foundation. And that then rolled into something called the Tatlatory scandal, which I was involved in exposing, but before it was possible to expose that, it sadly led to a young activist taking his own life because they were making the same threats towards him and telling him that they were going to destroy his career and smear him in the press. And my sense is that because of his young age, I think he was in his very early 20s at the time.
Yeah, he was 21.
He believed them. Yeah, he believed them, and he believed that his life was over, and so he took his own life. And he put all this in his suicide note, and mentioned a lot of the people involved. And I had been, as I say, writing about it since 2014 and warning publicly about it, so we were able to expose much of what was going on. And there was a formal investigation into it, which uncovered a lot of information, but Conservative Central Office didn't do anything about it. And one of the key people involved in that, Carrie Symonds, who was the head of broadcast media at the time at CCHQ and was one of the people charged with putting these smears out there, is now, of course, in very senior quarters in number 10 Downing Street, and a number of the other individuals are still around and operating as well. Mark Clark became known as the Tatler Tory, and the scandal was called the Tatler Tory scandal. And so him and many others are thankfully no longer in politics at all. Grant Shapps, the then chairman of the Conservative Party, was forced to resign. He is now, of course, back under a different guise, although not under a different name, as he sometimes likes to do. And so a lot of these people are still around, and they're still operating in the same way, that if you are a dissenter, if you do ask questions about the Conservative Party, the direction of things, and if you do campaign for the Conservative Party to return to conservative values, you get all of these mysterious attacks and smears against you in the press that are designed, I believe, not just to damage your political career, but to damage your life and also damage your personal life. And it's been the case for me. And I think what pushed Elliot Johnson over the edge was that this massively overlapped with his social life. So he wasn't just looking at losing his career, he was also looking at losing a lot of friends who were going to side with the Conservative Party over him. Now, in my case, I always vowed to never date anyone in politics and never have any friends in politics. Unfortunately, I failed on the second point, because I have made some friends in politics against my will, awful people like Raheem Kassam. And I'm now unaccountably friends with them. But in my personal life, there were two romantic relationships that ended over this, because the people I was dating felt that whilst they knew me personally, the things that were written about me in the press made their lives too difficult, made their careers more difficult. They face pressure from their family and their friends. And I think that's the nastiest bit of this. I don't think that there should be any debate other than policy in politics. Yeah. And if you want to attack someone about where they stand on policy, fine. That's absolutely right. That's part of freedom of speech. It's part of debate. If you want to then attack them personally, I think that is unfortunate. If you want to then go beyond that and completely destroy their lives and force them to the point of suicide, then I think that is criminal. And people that do that need to be exposed, and they need to face justice, frankly. And that's, what I tried to do with exposing the Tatler Tory scandal, and it's what I have kept on since. And to go back to your question about the culture at CCHQ, that is the culture. It is full of people who, if you dissent, they will try and destroy your life. And that I think tells you all you need to know about the sort of people involved, and also the hope for the future of the Conservative Party with those sorts of people running it. And until we can get those people out, until we can expose them, then I think we've got to see the Conservative Party, as I say, not only as a poor ally, but as an enemy.
The accusation that was levelled against you was made by a quote unquote unnamed senior Tory. So it was, sounds like the party machine here. Well, you mentioned that there are consequences for questioning the direction of the party. Does the party have a specific direction it's intending to go in, or is it just continuity?
Well, I think you can see across the West, and this has come up with the Build Back Better tagline, which is mysteriously the tagline of Joe Biden and Boris Johnson. I think you can go hard into the realms of David Icke conspiracy, but I think there is certainly coordination going on across the West. There is an establishment view, and there's an establishment view whether you are in Washington, whether you are in London, whether you are in Paris, whether you are in Madrid, and it is the same view. It is the same view that the status quo needs to remain in place. The public must continue to be given an illusion of democracy, but we can't ever allow a dangerous situation where the public are placed in charge and the dangerous views of the public actually find their way to policy. And there are clearly individual decisions that are made. You know, my background is actually in international relations, and I happened to get involved in the same-sex marriage campaign just because I thought it was bad policy. But you look at a campaign like that, and it's very interesting, isn't it, how at the same time the United Kingdom was pushing forward same-sex marriage, France was pushing forward, or France had previously pushed forward same-sex marriage, Australia was on the way to pushing forward same-sex marriage. The US Supreme Court suddenly discovered that it was the intention of the founding fathers to always allow same-sex marriage. So you can see with certain policies, who knows where or how these things are decided. The trans issue, another great example. Immigration, the Dublin Accords and what rolled into the Morocco Accords. There is clear synergy and coordination that whatever country you are in, at least in the West, this is the status quo view. And yes, you can pop up as a Nigel Farage, or you can pop up as a Jeremy Corbyn, and you will be viciously attacked when you do. But really very little changes. And even under the government of Donald Trump, that we were told was going to be the absolute apocalypse and World War III and all the rest of it. Trump did a lot, but nothing really changed, did it? Well, I mean, all of the same things were getting pumped out in the media. You're seeing the same influences placed on society, and you're seeing the same big corporates and plutocrats in charge and pulling the strings. And this was supposed to be a guy who was going to completely drain the swamp and flip it on his head. So what I observe in politics, there's the old adage, the problem with elections is whoever you vote for, politicians get in. And I think that speaks to the establishment and what is going on, that even when you get a rebel force like Donald Trump, nothing really changes, despite the fact that the public clearly want it to.
Well, it's the illusion of democracy in the 21st century is that the White House or Downing Street is the epitome of power. It's now just one in a series of equally level powerful institutions. For example, I'd say nowadays big tech or entertainment or the academy is as powerful as the higher levels of government now, in terms of...
Well, I mean, Andrew Breitbart said that politics is downstream culture, not economics. And I think that's absolutely right, especially for our age. The act of the big tech social media companies to remove Donald Trump from their platforms whilst he was still president, I think will be seen as a watershed moment where big tech or big corporate was flexing its muscles. Of course, they've been doing it privately for since time immemorial, but now they are publicly saying we are more powerful than the president of the United States, and therefore we are more powerful than any nation or any leader.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can look in the news at any point in the last couple of months where Uganda, Myanmar, all these cases of the Silicon Valley oligarchies intervening in sovereign nations. These the only thing missing from these companies is a seat at the UN.
Yeah, and I think that is extremely dangerous because, of course, there's very little accountability to the public in that cause. But I think there is the bigger point, which is that these social media companies have come through, but all they're really doing, they're not saying anything radical. They're simply pushing against anyone who wants to change the status quo. So it's not like they've come through with a new set of political ideas and they're turning everything on their head. They've come through to uphold the establishment view. Where does big tech differ from a Bill Clinton? Where does big tech differ from a Tony Blair? They're just extensions of that same globalist establishment approach. And so I think that's whilst big tech is a massive question and it's a major danger to our lives and liberty. The wider question is this globalist establishment project, which whatever elections say remains in place, and however much the public dissent against it remains in place, and whatever companies rise or fall remains in place.
Yeah, the quote that comes to mind for me is where there's propaganda, there's hope. If they feel the need to pump this propaganda out,
right,
then
right. If you watch Netflix, wall to wall propaganda now, and you whatever it is, the new series Bridgerton, they feel the need to fill it with a disproportionate number of ethnic minority people. Now, there's nothing wrong with having ethnic minority people in films or TV shows, or gay people, or people that are 8 foot tall, people that are 1 foot tall, whatever. The point is that when that is the purpose of the show, when the purpose of the show is to say that immigration's nothing new, you go back to Georgian England and there were all sorts of people of different races, it's simply not true. And just in the same way that in so much of their other content, there was the Queen's Gambit recently, which was a very good, well-produced series that was this faux history presentation of it's presented as history, but it never happened. And the narrative is that a young female chess player became the chess world champion, but had to do so under the strain of the patriarchy trying to stop her. Now, of course, not only did that never happen, but I would argue that if there was a young woman that came forward today, or even 20 years ago, that wanted to become chess world champion, people would be falling over themselves to make that happen. It didn't happen, and it hasn't happened. And the fact that it hasn't happened certainly is not down to the patriarchy. The Crown, another great example, where you've got this dramatization of history presented as fact, but is a clear distortion of what really went on. So figures like Margaret Thatcher are these nasty figures whose main intent was to promote racism in South Africa.
Right.
And the problem is that for particularly young people, I think, watching that is their history. They're not reading widely around it. They're not getting other sources. If they're watching history at all, if they're watching programs about history at all, they are these dramatizations, which are falsehoods. And to me, you've got to ask, well, why is this being done? And as you say, it is propaganda, pure and simple. And frankly, it's propaganda that would put the Soviet Union to shame in terms of its blatancy. And you can also see it in public events now. I mean, every football game now begins with a taking of the knee to George Floyd, which I think we've now reached the point, and reached it long ago, where that is the longest period of mourning for any figure in British history. And of course, George Floyd was not British. He was not a figure from British history, and the events that occurred in relation to George Floyd has absolutely nothing to do with Britain. That mark of silence before a game that went on for almost 2 years was not seen after World War II. It was not seen after the passing of monarchs. It was not seen for any individual or event in British history. And then in football, you have every surface that can possibly be plastered with either the rainbow flag or the BLM slogan.
Or the NHS.
And of course, it did. And of course, none of this has got anything to do with football. It is simply propaganda. Why is it necessary that, and again, I think it's very important to separate the LGBT lobby from people who happen to be gay, many of whom very strongly oppose the LGBT lobby. But why is it that at a football match, the corner flag needs to be marked with the flag of the LGBT lobby that is talking about the fact that people have all different kinds of sexuality? I mean, the context is extraordinarily odd and inappropriate, and it just smacks of not only propaganda but desperate propaganda. And as you say, in some ways, whilst I think it is a complete disgrace that all of this stuff is going on, and that the public is not being listened to on it because there's huge public opposition to it and the tearing down of the statues and all the rest of it, whilst I think all that is outrageous, and indeed outrageous that the government is doing nothing, and indeed outrageous that the Conservative Party is doing nothing, I take some heart in it, because they wouldn't, as you say, be doing it if they weren't desperate. And I think that's what we've got to remember when we're pushing back against this stuff, is that they're getting increasingly desperate in the way that these things are being employed. And I think that suggests that whilst we don't have as big a voice in the mainstream media, we do have as big a voice in the bar rooms, or the now illegal bar rooms, but in the front rooms of the people of Britain.
Also, we've entered a cultural lull where, for some bizarre reason, symbolic value has overtaken objective standard in terms of what makes something good. You know, like there's no benefit to portraying Georgian England as being multicultural other than symbolic value.
Right. Yeah. I just think it's more sinister than that, actually. Yes, there's that symbolic value to say that it is that having a multiracial society is an inherent good, but there is also the clear attempt to mislead that is what history looked like. And you can see it as well in films like 1917, where yes, there were Sikh regiments, but the chances of you sort of having a snapshot of the battlefield and seeing a lot of them would be very low. I'm a particular fan of a Sky series called Britannia, about the Roman invasion of Britain. Again, very good series, just like 1917 is a very good film, just like The Queen's Gambit is a very good TV show. Very good series, Britannia, but sort of 10 to 20% of the Roman soldiers are ethnic minorities. Now, that simply was not the case. And the image that is clearly being presented is that at any time in human history, we had this very multiracial, multicultural society. And whether you believe that is a good thing or not, what is undeniable is that it is not true. That is not what occurred. That is not what Georgian Britain looked like. And it is therefore clearly an attempt to mislead, particularly young people, that is the case, and that all this talk about mass immigration is overblown, because what's the problem? It was always like this.
Right. Yeah. But in reality, it wasn't really prior to the Windrush generation.
No, I mean, it would, going back to Roman Britain, I think that people would have not really known how to process seeing ethnic minorities march across the British fields. But even as recently, I would say, as the 1950s, the sort of image that is presented in Bridgerton would have been extraordinarily unusual, and would have been met with I think it would have been commented on, if there were courtiers in Buckingham Palace of all different ethnicities. I think people would have found that extraordinary. And I mean, I'm very much against multiculturalism. I see no problem with a nation made up of different races that are all British and are all proud of being British. But again, I come back to the point of it is simply historically inaccurate, and therefore you have to ask the question: what is the intent of that? Why are these major media companies, these major film studios, so desperate to present that image, so desperate to change history in that way? Because it is deliberate. It's not an accidental thing, and they say, "Oh, we didn't realize, we just happened to cast these people." It's clearly deliberate, and therefore you have to ask a question of what are they intending to do? Why are they spending so many hundreds of millions on these productions that put across this view? And my sense is that these vehicles, the narrative and the storyline that are built around these things are mere Trojan horses for these sort of messages that now the establishment is very keen to push. And again, it is an attempt to mislead the public, which I think must be challenged very strongly.
Do you think it's authentic, or is it just at the mercy of the prevailing cultural orthodoxy? For example, if God willing, the prevailing culture was that of conservatism, would mass culture then just reflect that, or is it an authentic ideological push?
Well, I think it's a very ideological push, and I go back to what I said about Trump. During the Trump presidency, if anything, the manufacture of this stuff massively increased. It was not the case that Trump was elected and so Hollywood said, "Okay, we've got this a bit wrong. Now we realize that at least half of the country don't agree with us. We better start making some more conservative programming." They did the opposite. They started making even more progressive programming, liberal progressive programming. And I think that tells the story that it makes no sense from a business point of view to have a company like Gillette come out and say that men are wrong and evil. That's their customer base, right? So from what I happen to date someone who's very senior in advertising for a long time, and where I think the transition has come from, talking to her about those experiences, is that in the past CEOs were just interested in the bottom line, and if they thought there was money to be made by putting the rainbow flag on something, they put the rainbow flag on something. Now I think we've reached a point where those CEOs for some of these companies like Procter and Gamble, Netflix, Microsoft, Facebook, Twitter, they've got so much money that really they can afford to lose 20 billion over making something or doing something that hurts their customer base. Right. They don't see their roles now as to make money. They see their roles as to change the world. So Twitter will take Donald Trump off its platform, even though it knows that it will probably lose 20-30% of its customer base, which will cost them huge amounts of money. But they can afford to lose that sort of money, and they think that it is more important that they push an ideological narrative than it is that they make money. And so I think that's a transition we've seen over the last few decades. And it means that I think a lot of these companies now see themselves as too big to fail, and they see their purpose to change the world and push it towards that liberal globalist way of thinking.
But there's also a self-interested element too, where yes, you have financial capital, but you have social capital as well. If you're seen by the mass culture as being sufficiently woke, that can benefit you, not financially, but in terms of your standing and things in the sort of the hierarchy of.
But that's the problem. It's a question of what is society. it will enhance your credibility in certain quadrants of society and destroy it in others. And this is the great problem that Brexit and Trump demonstrated. And Bill Clinton, after the Trump vote, was said to have said, we thought we had changed their minds, but we'd actually just silenced their voices. And so what you see with the Trump vote, what you see with the Brexit vote is, I think, very arguably half the country or half the population, and perhaps even more than half the population, is very strongly opposed to this stuff. So yes, by taking the woke line, you may be more popular in the dining circles of Notting Hill or the dining circles of New York and Soho, but you make yourself public enemy number one in Texas, Arizona, and the home counties. So I think it is an ideological push. And you've got to remember as well that these people are cultural leaders. So it is much more likely that in their social circles, they are the ones that others are deferring to rather than vice versa. They're leading the way. And maybe if they changed their tack and adopted conservatism, many of the sycophants around them would change to that cause as well. So I see that there's a social aspect to it, but it doesn't reflect society as a whole. And I think the bigger driver is a desire to push the world in a globalist liberal direction
for the benefit of very few people.
I think that is a big question: is why? Why is there such an attempt, and why is there such collaboration and coordination among these groups, which is clearly there? I mean, you can talk conspiracy theorists, but I don't think that anyone could deny that there is that clear coordination going on, at least across the West.
Yeah. I mean,
the same kinds of media being produced, the same kinds of political taglines being put out there, the same kinds of policy being pushed through Parliament without the support of the public. Penny Mordaunt the other day came into politics as a small C Conservative, was a bit of a darling of the right for a while, and went before Parliament and said, trans men are men, trans women are women. There's no public support for that. There's no support among Penny Mordaunt's base for that. There is no support in the Conservative movement for that. So why is she doing it? And the first question is this going on? And I think that question is very clearly proven that it is. The question as to why, you could argue it is because the vested interests want to maintain the status quo. I don't personally believe that, because of course on certain issues they're pushing to change the status quo. You could argue that there is a final destination that they are aware of and that the public is not, that they're trying to take it to, whether that be more collective government on an international scale. It's hard to say. Whether they genuinely agree that this is the best direction for humanity, and it's a sort of they see themselves as betters as the public, and the public need to be led in a direction. It could be that. It could be something even more sinister. I don't think there is clarity on that, but that it is going on, I think there is now clarity on.
Yeah, I don't think it's as egalitarian as it's being made out to be. And Neil, I'm no tinfoil hat wearer, but I do see a massive power grab happening at the very least.
Yeah, I think it's undeniable at this point. The coordination is undeniable. The direction of travel is undeniable. The question as to why is is what remains unanswered. And the honest truth is I don't know why. I'm open to discussing and debating all sorts of theories on why.
I mean that can be a whole different interview of its own. But for the latter stages, I wanna go into Miss Carrie Symonds, because you've written a piece, or a series of pieces, sorry, for Bournbrook about her influence over the British government. First of all, what to your knowledge is her unofficial role in government?
Well, we talked about the Tatler-Tory scandal before and her involvement in it, and I have been investigating her since then. At the time, no one wanted to talk about her because she was a completely unknown figure. And, you know, Mark Clark kind of became famous for his misdeeds. And so people talked about him. Grant Shapps, obviously people knew who he was. So people talked about that. But Carrie Symonds was kind of left out of that discussion because she was a very much a background figure inside Conservative Central Office. But I've investigated her actions since, and I encourage your readers and listeners to do their own research on Carrie Symonds' background. And I've long felt, you know, that those people involved in the Tatler-Tory scandal have no place in politics whatsoever. They must be exposed. They must be investigated. But what, of course, occurred in the 5 or 6 years since is that she found her way unaccountably into number 10 Downing Street. And when Oliver Lewis was forced out, Oliver Lewis being the individual who was tasked and credited with a lot of the work on the Brexit deal and a lot of the detail work on that, he was the last of the Vote Leave figures to be forced out of Downing Street after, or the last major Vote Leave figures to be forced out of Downing Street after Lee Kane and Dominic Cummings. My colleague Nick Connor had worked with Oliver Lewis at Vote Leave, and he came to me when Oliver Lewis left, and said that he felt that, you know, now was the time to act, because he knew my past concerns about Carrie Symonds, but it was very clear that Carrie Symonds was now taking complete control of the government, in that the reports suggested that she was the key party in removing those 3 key government advisors, and also the key party in bringing in their replacements. And so there's a bigger question then comes before us, which is, do we have an individual who is involved in governing the country, who has not been elected, who has not been appointed, and can be held to no account by the public? People often say with this debate, oh, well, Dominic Cummings wasn't elected, or Alistair Campbell wasn't elected. Both true, but they were accountable. They were appointed government officials. They had a framework of laws around them, which meant that they could be investigated for their actions. They were accountable to Parliament and their relevant minister, and they could be held to account for those actions. And if those actions were proven to be wrong or proven to be illegal, they could be censured, they could be fired, and they could be prosecuted for those actions. And what we have in Carrie Symonds is someone for whom none of those things are true. And Tony Benn proposed a series of tests, and those questions really drive at accountability and process. How did you get to the position you are in? What power do you have? Who gave you that power? Who are you accountable to? And how can you be fired? And I think if you look at each of those 5 questions and apply it to the Carrie Symonds situation, you realize you have a big problem, because she can't explain how she got there from a political point of view. She got there on a romantic basis. What powers does she have? Well, she is accorded consistently, very consistently, and convincingly in the press to have very significant powers. No one has officially given her those powers. She is not accountable to anyone, and she cannot be removed. So the reports as well now, I think, are reaching a point where early on, when we called for this, the pushback, I mean, that deserves the whole investigation of itself, because it's fascinating. But the initial pushback was, these are just rumours. There is no clear evidence of this, or that this is all Dominic Cummings, or it's all one individual or another. But there is absolutely no way that the entirety of the nation's press, and I think we're at a point now where every single newspaper has covered this, would be running stories citing senior government sources, citing senior members of the civil service, citing members of parliament, citing government advisors, citing political officials at Conservative Central Office. There is absolutely no way that the press would be doing all those things without being sure of those sources. And they certainly wouldn't be going on the strength of Dom Cummings saying, well, I'll tell you what happened. And they certainly wouldn't be going on the strength of me saying, well, I'll tell you what happened. All of those sources must come direct. If a senior civil service member is quoted as a source, it will have come from a senior member of the civil service. I know the journalism has declined to a very low ebb, but it is simply not believable that all of these reports are manufactured and there's no sources behind them. I think it's very true that most people are afraid to speak out publicly about it, right? Because since the Bow Group came out, we have been smeared in the press universally, the most extraordinary accusations made about the Bow Group. But none of those accusations actually spoke to the question we are asking, which is, what is the role of Carrie Symonds in government? And we're calling for an inquiry and an investigation into that. And I think we'd reached a point at the time, but we've now certainly reached a point where that is very merited. And my sense is from the reports that we have a situation which is unconstitutional, where we have a situation where someone who has not only a very bad and dangerous track record in politics, but also who has no legitimate legal power to govern, is governing and is doing so unaccountably and without proper due process and without having to answer to the public. And I think for Britain in 2021 to have reached that point is a disgrace, and it's not something we can allow to happen to this country.
You write in your first part of the series, and I'm quoting you here, as Miss Symonds has no role in government, she is not accountable to anyone and therefore cannot legally hold powers to govern, something you were just talking about. What are the constitutional ramifications of such a figure in British government? Does it just undermine the whole notion of it?
Well, it does. And there was a court case recently brought by the National Farmers Union regarding the government's decision to curtail badger culling in Devon. Now, it so happens that the Bow Group wrote a paper on badger culling and raised serious concerns about the cost and efficacy of badger culling. And I think those concerns have now come to fruition and are clear in the 9 years since that the results have not been what the government said they were going to be. So actually on that issue, we happen to agree with the sorts of things that Carrie Symonds seems to be pushing for. But the problem with the court case was that it found that Symonds was a key party in the government's decision to stop that badger culling. But because she did not have an official government position, she could not be cited. There was no record. There was no black box of government to say, right, well, who held these meetings? Where are the minutes of these meetings? And that's something that government advisors are required to do. That's something that ministers are required to do. There has to be a record of decision making. And the problem with this court case was that it didn't stack up, because there were big scenes missing where there were no records of what went on. And that's because the people involved were not government officials, and yet they were acting on the authority of government. And now, look, badgers aren't the most important thing in the world, but I think you can see just from that issue alone what potential ramifications that has for the rest of government.
Yeah.
If the public can't see how decisions are being made, why decisions are being made, and who is making them, then we have departed from democracy in quite a severe way. And I really do think, and you can see this with some of the narrative around lockdown as well. It's not so much about the issue, it's about the process, and it is about the step away from democracy we are taking with a lot of this stuff, and the step away from accountability we are taking with a lot of this stuff. And you've got to remember, I mean, it's easy to be melodramatic about these things, but these are rights and freedoms that have been won in Britain over thousands of years. Blood spilled, blood, sweat and tears, efforts made, people martyred, careers sacrificed in order to get us to a position where we do have sacrosanct things, or we're supposed to have sacrosanct things like equality before the law, freedom of speech, accountability, habeas corpus. You know, these are the foundations of our society, and when they are attacked, I think that it's very important that not only we push back for our own personal sake, but we push back for the sake of the work of our ancestors in getting us to this point, and the sake of future generations to come.
I want to ask you about the extent to which Ms. Symonds plays a role in government policy. I mean, as you mentioned earlier in the interview, the party has lurched towards a sort of an unhinged approach to environmentalism, a very globalized approach as well. The only public work that Ms. Symonds does is with the non-profit Oceana, which is a green think tank. What does that tell you about the the role of the PM's girlfriend in affecting public policy and the what should be severe conflicts of interest within her personally?
Well, I mean, I think that I encourage your listeners and readers to look into Oceana themselves and look into the associations it has. But I don't think that there can be any disagreement with a private individual working for or having association with any organization, really. The problem is that when you then combine that with having a role unaccountably in government, that is where you arrive at the conflicts of interest. It's not the Oceana point that's the problem. It's the role in government point that's the problem. Yeah. Now, if the public had had a chance to scrutinize Carrie Symonds in an election, and she had said, well, look, I'm part of this Oceana charity, and the public have said, okay, we understand that, we're going to vote for you anyway, then you've got a process of scrutiny there. You've then got a second process of scrutiny where, if it is seen that whilst in government, Carrie Symonds is taking actions not because they are in the interest of the people, but because they are the lobby interests of a group like Oceana, then that can then be investigated. So I think you can, there's no reason why public figures can't be involved in charities, can't be involved in campaigns. There is a reason why people who aren't public officials, who aren't government officials, who aren't elected officials can be involved in government. That's the problem. Carrie Symonds has no more role in government as any other British citizen legally. She has no right to govern any more than any other British citizen, just because of who she's sleeping with is immaterial. There's no legal provision in Britain, and I'm not aware of many countries that there are legal provisions for the girlfriend of the Prime Minister or the significant other of the Prime Minister or leader to have constitutional legal powers. I mean, I was talking to a very senior historian about this the other night, and he was saying that there is no example of anything like this in British history. You would have to go back to medieval French history in order to find an example of this sort of interference by a mistress of the monarch in government.
There's a weird sort of Margaret of Anjou sort of energy coming off.
Well, that example was cited, but I think what is more apt, as I say, is Marie Antoinette. Someone who was mistress and wife, and was accorded with the powers to govern. I don't think that Margaret of Anjou or Catherine Howard or Anne Boleyn, I mean, I should say at this point, my background is not as a historian,
Mm.
But I don't see in any of those figures a similarity to what is reported to be going on here. And I think it's rather unfortunate that even if you do get into the medieval debate of, is it more like Anne Boleyn, is it more like Marie Antoinette, why are we debating medieval politics as to what should be happening in Britain in 2021?
Right.
There should be no examples of medieval mistresses or wives that should be relevant to politics now. Politics now must be about democracy and accountability to the people. And so, yes, you can debate which medieval figure or which medieval period this is more like, but what the hell are we doing in 2021 engaged in that process? It's sort of baffling and unbelievable this has been allowed to happen. And let me be clear, you know, I am very concerned about Carrie Symonds, her character and what she's doing, but it is not purely Carrie Symonds' fault. This has been allowed to occur by Boris Johnson and other cabinet ministers and other people in Number 10. And they should be the ones that are most strongly standing up against this sort of behaviour. And frankly, you know, I speak to a lot of Conservative MPs privately who are very concerned about this, but none of them are willing to come out and speak publicly because there is that problem of the personal connection to the Prime Minister. But it is the job of members of Parliament to hold the government to account and to defend the British Constitution, to defend democracy, and to defend our law. I'm not seeing enough of that in politics. And now, yes, the third estate, the journalistic world has started to look into this more, but it is the Bow Group that first asked this question, and we will do so, and we wanted to do so in the circumstances, but it shouldn't really be us doing it. This is something that Parliament should be doing. This is something that journalists should be looking into, and quite frankly, this is something that the Prime Minister should be bringing a swift conclusion and an end to. And at the moment, you know, those things aren't happening. So I think you can see a failure of a lot of institutions, the judiciary as well. You know, I think that there are arguments on the fringes of this debate, if some of the things are true, that the law has been broken.
I mentioned before we started recording about what I observe as being a direct link between Fleet Street and the upper echelons of the Tory party. Carrie Symonds' parents were both closely involved with the independent paper. Boris Johnson himself was editor of The Spectator. Does this hint towards a wider issue of a sort of cronyism between the British establishment and the British press?
It does, and I think that's led to the lack of accountability. What Carrie Symonds and her friends were until very recently briefing was that she was untouchable because she had this wonderful Rolodex of people in the press that would come to her defence. That may have been true at one time. I think what will be seen to be the case is that a lot of those people were actually fair weather friends, so that if wrongdoing is exposed, I think very few will defend it. We had the early run when the Bow Group first came out and called for this. We were smeared as being sexist old dinosaurs across the press. The Guardian said that the Bow Group was the sort of organisation that supports the wing of the Conservative Party who has a wife in the country but is grooming a 19-year-old assistant in London. I mean, really outrageous stuff. And you know, the Bow Group is one of the few organisations that has campaigned to expose things like Westminster paedophile scandal and sex abuse, the Tatler Tory scandal. So no basis in fact, and you know, quite sort of vicious and nasty smears came out from across the press. But as more information about this has come out, I think you're seeing fewer and fewer people defend it or attack those that are raising concerns about it. And I think that is because most of the friends and supporters, as I say, of Carrie Symonds were fair weather friends. But it has led to a lack of objectivity in the past, I believe, and it is one of the main reasons why this has been allowed to happen without serious challenge, because a lot of people knew about this. A lot of people in the world of journalism are very, very closely involved in this, and very, very closely involved with Carrie Symonds, including, very senior journalists being Carrie Symonds' past partner, very close friends of hers.
Mm.
And she has clearly worked and manipulated the media to her cause going back 6 years for when she was in CCHQ. So there are definitely questions to be asked and answered about what the media's role in this is. But I think from now on, a lot of people will start to think, okay, I can see the way this is going, and we better actually start looking into this. So that's been an important battle won. But how we got to the point where there was that level of cronyism, I think, does need to be looked into, yes.
Well, I mean, this sort of thing was exposed 10 years ago with the Leveson inquiry, right? How close the media was to the government. We had people like Rebecca Brooks and Andy Coulson. It seems to me that culture hasn't really changed at all in the last 10 years.
No, it hasn't. And of course, the establishment's very adaptive. We had it with Leveson, we had it with the Tatler-Tory scandal, and we've got it now with Carrie's coup. They as what happened with phone hacking, and by the way, I think a lot of that is still going on. We have a lot of problems in the Bow Group with hacking and things like that. In the Tatler-Tory scandal and in this current scandal, you see the press back off the issue and then start to talk about how terrible and outrageous it was, and that they were actually the ones that exposed it in the first place. But then they return to form in a different way. So just like the establishment with Brexit, nothing really changes. But I think what has changed, and what is very important, and particularly in regard to organisations like Bournbrook, is you now have an array of media that is not clubbable by the establishment. The Prime Minister cannot get the editor now of every news outlet on the phone and tell them not to cover this story, because there are just too many news outlets. And of course, those news outlets may not have the reach of the Guardian, the Sun, the BBC News, but they do have a reach, and they do get these questions out into the public. And as Winston Churchill once said, the truth is like a lion, it can defend itself. Once the truth gets out there, it has a drip, drip, drip effect. And eventually it tends to rise to the very top of the political debate if that truth is about something very significant, which I think this is. And that's what we've seen with this. I wrote my first, I've done a lot of tweets about it and written about it generally, but I think it's true that I wrote my first article about Carrie Symonds at Bournbrook. Since that time, it is now in every newspaper in Britain. And by the way, it seems to be being covered in Asia, in France, in the United States, in Spain. This is now a global news story. And it's a global news story because we were able to start talking about it in outlets that the establishment don't control and cannot control. So I think it's absolutely, the mainstream media stitch up is a major problem, but there are solutions to that problem.
Yeah, there is peripheral media, and you spoke. We're recording this on Saturday, but you spoke yesterday to Raheem Kassam about it, who obviously has big reach in America. So far, what's the response been from across the pond about this?
Well, as I say, it is now being quite well covered in the United States, because I think Americans see Britain as a very close ally, see Britain as a parent of democracy in the world, and find it as extraordinary as we find it that something like this has occurred. So I can see that a lot of US news outlets are now reporting the story. Of course, it's nowhere near as big a story as it is in the UK because of the significance of it, particularly to the UK. But I see the same thing in Spanish media. Part of my family is Spanish. I lived in Spain for much of my life, and I've been getting calls from the Spanish press. As I say, you can see it covered across Asia. I don't know what a lot of it says, because it is in Mandarin and other languages. But yeah, it's now a global news story, and it won't go away because all of those questions remain unanswered. And now not just the British public, but the world want to know what the answer is.
I'll finish with this line of questioning: is given that this story is now proliferated, what can we as everyday Conservatives who are outside of the machine do to hold this part of the government to account?
Well, I think you've got to keep talking about it. You've got to keep writing about it. You've got to get the message across that we will not tolerate the abuse of our democracy in this way. I think the next step after that is we've got to start pursuing the investigation, pursuing the evidence, freedom of information requests, judicial reviews, and as I say, members of Parliament need to start taking this issue up. I mean, because I have association with many Conservative members of Parliament, that's the first place that I see that something should be done. But actually, we have an opposition. The point of the opposition is to hold the government to account. Where are they? I mean, when we first came out with this, Jess Phillips, the Labour MP, called us sexist. Now it's apparent that there's been all sorts of very dodgy dealings and malfeasance going on. Where's the Labour Party asking these questions? They've got to be there too. The opposition parties have got to be there too. The Parliament has got to be there, holding the government to account. So I think where this has to go next is really to those institutions, to the judiciary, to Parliament, and they've got to act on behalf of the people. We've raised the question, we've exposed it, and now they need to be shown to be taking action on it, because that is their job.
Well, I look forward to leading the charge with you from us here at Bournbrook and you over at the Bow Group. Ben, thank you for lending your time and your insights.